Thank you, Director Graywall, for those thoughtful and inspiring remarks. With that, I'd like to invite the next panel. We've already begun talking about the interrelationship between physical abuse and financial abuse or financial exploitation, and we have a phenomenal panel to talk about those issues. So with that.
Hi again. I am Paige Ulrey. I am with the King County Prosecutor's Office in Seattle, Washington. Can you guys hear me okay? Yes, okay. And I was a prosecutor doing domestic violence work when my boss asked me in 2001 if I would prosecute elder abuse. And at that time, I think there were just a handful of people dedicated to this work, both in law enforcement and in prosecutors' offices. And I too, as Cher mentioned, had no idea what the heck I was doing, but I said yes because my boss asked me to do the work. And it ended up being a truly life-changing decision for me because this work is so important and so vital to all of us. And I just can't begin to tell you how honored I am to be here today and to see how far we've come in these 20-something years. And I want to thank Andy and Shelley and the SEC for all the work that you've done to make this happen. It's really wonderful to be here.
Oh, see if you can hear me. Yes. Okay. So I am actually Officer Candace Simeone. I've been in law enforcement now for 20 years. My first beat, if you will, was at Kennebunkport, Maine, which is inundated with an older community. And I immediately started connecting a lot of adopted grandparents that I wanted to take care of. And so I made it my mission to do just so throughout my career. And one of the things that I found very, very important to do was to develop a multidisciplinary team in 2005 called the York County Elder Abuse Task Force, because I realized that within our profession, I really had no go-tos. I had no idea what I was doing, but I knew I had a lot of victims of older people who were being victimized. And so I developed a multidisciplinary team, and it's carried me throughout my career, which I'm very proud of, and I'm the president of that task force. We are going to talk to you today about a few things. I got to figure out this clicker. I'm not allowed to use a clicker at home, so this is exciting. But bear with me. So we're going to give some general facts about the elder financial exploitation definitions and some cases that we've come up against throughout our careers from a detective's perspective as well as a prosecutor's perspective, which is extremely valuable to me because I don't have the luxury of speaking with somebody like Paige on a regular basis, and she completely inspires me. We're going to talk about what we need to do from our perspectives moving forward, and we will conclude with an open forum so you guys can ask us some questions. I'm really happy to be part of this today, truly, and to be so passionate about a niche of crime in our profession that has not really been identified or supported early on in my career to a national summit that I actually get to be part of is pretty profound for me. So I get a little emotional. But for years, I've been teaching cadets at the Criminal Justice Academy, the public, other professions on elder justice, elder exploitation, and I'm generally met with hazy eyes, people who are yawning. And to look out and see all of you actually looking at me and excited to learn and be part of a networking community going forward is just, it's completely inspiring to me. So I'm really excited about this. We'll do our best. We could talk probably for about 2 days about our jobs, and we're trying to squish it into an hour. So please use the opportunity later on to come and meet with us. We'll talk about our cases more.
Okay, I was thinking we would skip lunch though, actually, if you guys don't.
Yeah, actually, we're not doing lunch now. You're just going to stay with us, and we're going to, I totally could do that. So there are two facts that Paige and I found profound, and we wanted to share with you to start our segment. Older adults in the United States lose approximately $28 billion per year to perpetrators of financial exploitation. And this one. So you'll notice that our segment does not cover physical abuse, sexual abuse. We are just exclusively talking about financial exploitation. And so we found this statistic that 1 in 43 cases ever come to light when it comes to financial exploitation of our older population.
So we have this major issue of underreporting, as you guys probably are well aware of elder abuse. And I think there's myriad reasons why we're not getting the cases that we should be getting, why we're getting only the ones, above sea level. But this is just a list of some of the things that I can think of about why we're not getting cases referred from mandatory reporters and other professionals who might come into contact with elder abuse. I think there's a lot of misinformation and lack of knowledge about what financial exploitation is and whether, this is the person's free choice. As adults, we have the right to do what we want to with our money. So how do I know if this is financial exploitation or just them exerting a choice that might be unpopular? And we don't have much training on that, not for doctors, not for bankers, not for law enforcement or prosecutors. So I think that adds to the fact that we have a lot of work to do to properly respond to these cases better. We don't have much training on dementia, and I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about dementia, a lot of assumptions that are made about either people not being able to make choices if they have dementia, or assumptions that someone doesn't have dementia just because they're not obviously impaired. I think a lot of professionals are afraid of intruding on an older person's privacy, so they don't want to ask questions that might reveal elder abuse or financial exploitation. People who are paid caregivers might be afraid of losing the person's business if they get too intrusive with questions, so they kind of don't go there with them. I think financial institutions may be afraid of liability if they challenge an older person's decisions about what they're doing with their finances. And then a lot of victims themselves may discourage reporting for a lot of reasons. If we can go to the next slide, which I have right here. I didn't test this out. How did I do this, Candace? Okay, great.
Isn't it exciting?
It is very exciting. And now I have to go back. Okay, here we go. Oh, God. Okay. Okay. And these are some reasons why victims themselves often don't report. They have a lot at stake. Many people are afraid that if I report that I have been exploited or that my son is exploiting me, I'm going to lose my home. I'm going to be the one, as Cher said earlier, who is taken out of my home and put into a nursing home. And that very legitimately is many people's worst fear. And they'd rather oftentimes continue to endure whatever it is they're enduring if it means they can stay in their homes. A lot of people who are being exploited love the perpetrator. So reporting on them is not something that they can stomach. They may be afraid of retaliation by the perpetrator. They may need the perpetrator to keep them in their home, or just because that perpetrator may be one of the few people they have left in the world. And they may be ashamed. And I am sure you guys too have heard this, like victims who have been exploited saying, I was so stupid, I just was so stupid, and blaming themselves rather than blaming the perpetrator for the victimization. And I think that also contributes to their not reporting very often. And then people who have cognitive impairment may not even recognize that they're being exploited in the first place. So lots of barriers for older people who are being exploited to reporting. But I think of all the different risk factors for elder financial exploitation, these are the two that we see most commonly. People who are isolated, who are very dependent on the perpetrator for care or for their emotional needs or their physical needs, and then people who have some degree of dementia. And as Dr. Mosqueda said in her presentation, most of the victims we see who are exploited are in an early stage of Alzheimer's or some other form of dementia. And oftentimes it's undiagnosed. So they're probably still living in their home. No precautions are being taken to protect them because no one has even realized that they have a cognitive impairment. And that puts them at tremendous risk of exploitation.
And we're still digging out of COVID, realistically. We're seeing some of the implications of that isolation that occurred during COVID with our older population now. So, that's something that's we're still trying to fight through because the isolation is at the nth degree right now because of that.
And then even when cases are reported, we still have other hurdles that make these cases so difficult. We are still very behind as far as our ability to coordinate with other disciplines on these cases. We saw today how there are a bunch of people who are in MDTs, but more law enforcement, more prosecutors are not in any kind of MDT. Very few offices still at this point have a dedicated elder abuse prosecutor. Few police agencies have dedicated elder abuse detectives. And without that, it's very hard for us to effectively respond to these cases. And we're not coordinating between healthcare and the financial services industry and APS and all the different disciplines that really we need to be working with in order to respond effectively to these complex cases. So there's lots of things that need to be done still, and we'll be talking more about that as we progress with this presentation.
So as law enforcement officers, we have this awesome thing called discretion. We use it all the time. But there's also this really bad thing that we have in law enforcement, and that's discretion, right? So if we don't know what we see in front of us, we can't identify that we're looking at an elder abuse case, we have the discretion to move forward, to consider it a civil issue and to move forward and leave them behind. And it happens again and again. I've done it in my career countless times. I try to better myself and have these opportunities to tell you what's going on. So there, at least one, I think most of us subscribe to that magazine. We get it on a regular basis. I think it's monthly. And on 2 occasions, I've seen an elder abuse article, and this quote has been referenced in it. It's a former commanding officer out of NYPD, and he says, law enforcement is missing or overlooking a lot of cases. It's imperative that officers know the signs of elder abuse and take the time to investigate suspected cases. So today, like we said, we don't have videos or photos because this type of crime, we can see statements and, we can do search warrants on bank statements and see receipts, but to actually see elder abuse as a financial view, it's very hard. I call it, a lot of the officers I talk to, I'm like, these cases are like an onion. They've got several layers, they stink, and they may make you cry. And it's the truth, because it's not something as easy, and I don't say it's easy, but as obvious as a bruise, right? And like we were talking about earlier today, generally it's poly-victimization. So there's probably bruises under there too. You never know. But financial crime is very difficult for us to look through, not only because we're cops and we don't like numbers, but because there's generally some heartstrings that are attached to that, because we know that 90% of all the suspects that end up abusing our elders are somebody that they love and trust. So we compiled some cases that I've worked the last few years, just to kind of give examples of what's happening, what I'm seeing out in the field. And when I say I say the state of Maine, because I work hand in hand with several officers throughout our entire state. We talk about cases and we just try to make ourselves a little bit better. So you may be able to identify some of these cases because they're happening all the time in every state in the United States. So I cannot see that screen, so I'm gonna have to use my paper. You're right, Paige. Just for the record, it was funny because she was talking about preparing for cases, and she's always making sure. Someone had said, she was preparing me to make sure that I could do this. She's like, that's way too small. You're not going to be able to see it. I'm like, I'm fine. It's going to be great. She's right. I can't see it. Darn prosecutors. And it's the cool thing too. So we like to pass the buck. I'm just going to be honest. We're type A law enforcement. We're type A. We want to do the best that we can. We've got this all under control. We don't want to ask anybody else for help. And we're going to pass it off to Paige. And if it does not go through court as a success, it's her fault. She's the bad person. She did something wrong. Like, that's just how we are. So it's really cool to have opportunities where we're working together saying, we both screwed up. And we both take responsibility for this. Let's make ourselves better for next time. Instead of, I'm not going to talk to her anymore. The prosecutor's office sucks. Like, it's the way it is. That's how we are as law enforcement. So it speaks volumes that she's willing to stand up here with me for an hour and a half. And even though we talk different talks, we share the same heart. And I think that speaks volumes to this profession and this initiative and this summit. So this case drives me nuts. So I think it was Detective Hill who was talking about the spidey senses. When I talk to cadets at the Maine Criminal Justice Academy, I tell every one of them that they are born with the greatest tool in the world for law enforcement. And they all look at me crazy, like, okay, where is she going with this? And I say it's your gut punch. When something doesn't feel right, something's not right. And we can't turn the blind eye and say it's a civil issue. Work that case. Try. My gut punch happened when I met an older person who reached out to me at a talk with a cop or coffee with cops or whatever it was. I could tell he wanted to talk to me a little bit more, but I couldn't really figure it out. So I'm like, I got to pay a visit to him. And so I kind of developed a relationship with him. I made a visit to his house, and he talked about his son, but he wouldn't tell me much about his son. So I knew there was something, but I didn't know what. He wasn't comfortable talking with me yet. And so I asked around and realized that the son had been in and out of jail. He's had a criminal conviction, but the neighbors say, oh, he's so nice. He gets the mail for his father all the time. He's always taking care of his father, etc. Well, ironically, I arrested him and he went to jail, and his father started getting his own mail. And what ended up happening is he realized that he had a Dell computer that he never bought. He had credit cards that he never applied for, and that was all at the hands of his son. So when you feel that feeling, just explore more, pay a visit, be a little bit more proactive. I know it's hard, we don't have a lot of time, but that's been my greatest success in this field, is to reach out, be a little more proactive, because you never know what you're going to find in your communities. Taking older adults' money or assets without knowledge. We had a granddaughter who, she's like the perfect example of, you give her an inch, she's going to take a mile. And I think that's really classic with the suspects that I see, like nieces and nephews that go and visit the aunts or uncles once a week, etc. And they're taking $10, or they're taking this, or they're taking that, little things, until they realize, oh gosh, I'm missing all my jewelry, or I'm missing all my money. And then we have to backtrack. So I think it's important, if an older adult says something, believe them and investigate it more, because they're not going to tell you the whole truth. When Paige was talking about barriers, I wanted to interrupt, and I didn't, because I wanted to take this moment to say so. I don't know how many victims of elder abuse say to me, it's my fault, because it's the generation, I think. They are the awesomest generation in the whole entire world. They trust, they're just so genuine. I love them. But they drive me crazy, because they say, well, that's my grandson, or that's my son. I raised him. I must have done something wrong. That's my fault. And it breaks my heart, because you have to have that conversation and make them feel safe and tell them bad things about the people that they love the most. But that's a huge issue that we deal with, is that generation mindset that you can't tell them the first time you meet them that their son's bad and they're wrong. You've got to be proactive. You've got to go visit. You've got to go see them again. And then they're going to start telling you these stories that are going to break your heart. Caregivers with access to older adults' credit cards, online accounts, are making purchases for themselves. Awesome doctor in my community. His family all lived out of state, so they hired a caregiver. And they had spidey senses too, because they called me and they said, I don't really know what I'm reporting, but something doesn't feel right with this caregiver. She's really nice. I'm like, oh, okay. She's like, no, she's like really nice. I feel like there's something wrong, but I don't even know where to look. And so I started looking at things. We installed one of the Ring cameras for the family to see who's coming and going. And then we looked at the grocery bill, which was about $200 a week. And, the family's like, I don't know, it seems high. I'm like, high? My grocery bill's like, I was only me and my 11-year-old son, and it's like $200-300 a week. It should be fine. So I talked to him, and then I realized that this gentleman was actually 90% tube fed. So $200 a week is kind of excessive. And so we pulled receipts. It took a long time, and we realized that actually she, the caregiver, was going to the grocery store and purchasing iTunes, Amazon gift cards, increments of $50 at a time, which again looks fine. They're small increments. But after months and months and months, you realize, oh gosh, you give them an inch, they're going to take a mile. And it's very consistent with the suspects that I've dealt with. We'll skip that one. All right, this one drives me nuts. And so sometimes, we talk about the 90% of all the suspects that we generally deal with are family members or somebody they love and trust. I have never seen people fall in love with someone so fast as I have these pavers and landscapers and handymans that stop by our most vulnerable people in our community to help them out. They schmooze, they know what to say, they talk the talk. I kind of like want to sit there with popcorn sometimes. I'm like, this is really good acting. And they believe them. This case I'm going to take with me to my grave. It breaks my heart. Actually, I think all of them I'm going to take with me to my grave, because a lot of them I can't get to Paige for a plethora of reasons. But there was a landscaper who was canvassing a neighborhood locally and realized that there was an older woman who had this cute little house, but her shrubs were overgrown, her grass was getting longer. And so he stopped by one day and he said, listen, I've got 2 mouths to feed at home. My boss says I need to get one more account today. It's getting late. And can I help you out? You need at least a mow. And of course, he's schmoozy and he's nice, he's well dressed, he's handsome. And she says, well, and he says, no, I'll do it for a very small fee, $50. And so he did a great job with the lawn. It looked awesome. $50, not bad. And he couldn't get to the backyard. So he said, I'll come back. And usually, like the first example, they don't come back. They take the money and they run. However, he did come back and finished the backyard and then went back to her and said, hey, listen, I need to use the restroom. Can I use your restroom? Is it okay? And she says, absolutely. When he went inside the restroom, beside it was a table, and it was a shrine of her late husband and her recently passed son, who ironically was approximately the same age as this guy. And so I think that was his aha moment, because he wasn't a good guy. And so as he left, he said, I'll come back next week. I've got a lot of things going on, but I'll come back next week. And as he left, he looked at her in the eye and he grabbed her hand and said, can I call you mom? Within 6 months, he had bought her an excavator. He purchased a $365,000 house. He paid off her student loans. She paid off his student loans, sorry. Isolated all of her friends. She only had 2. Isolated those 2 wonderful people who were my witnesses, and would not go back to her doctors because she was starting to fail and she didn't want that to be known. And so she died 2 years later with the 2 witnesses outside of the nursing facility that she was placed in, crying. I was there. I can see it in my head right now. And he was inside holding her hand. And one of the promises was that she was going to move into the house. There was going to be an apartment above the garage built, and he would take care of her for the rest of her life, so she didn't have to go into a nursing home. And when she passed away, that house did not have an apartment above the garage. So this kind of stuff's happening all the time. And, so they're like, all right, so what would you have done? What could you have done? How could you have made that better? I could have planted seeds. I could have planted seeds before she met him and had that opportunity with her as a proactive law enforcement officer to say, hey, I know you're not volunteering anymore, and your shrubs or whatever. Can I help you out? There's some great resources in the community, something. Or had those friends plant those seeds before. It's all about stopping it before it starts, because I'm finding with these crimes, we might be able to give some money back, probably not, but we're not going to be able to give her dignity back or her trust or her independence. And so I think the moral of the story with these cases that never get to page is that we need to stop it before it starts. Don't give anybody inches. Don't let them get to that mile, okay? And that's a collective effort of all of us. Abuse of power of attorney all the time. As a matter of fact, Derek and I were at dinner last night, and I got 2 cases where people are abusing power of attorney. They think it's the power to steal, and they don't realize that they have fiduciary responsibilities to not accept large prizes and presents and whatever else they're calling them. Paige is going to talk about that a little bit more, so I'm not going to go into detail, but it's happening. Understand what power of attorney is, because us as cops, when I first started working, I was told if they talk about a power of attorney or they have paperwork, it's civil. You're going to get sued. Don't do anything with it. Have them contact legal services for the elderly, which is a good step. Legal services for the elderly are fantastic. But you feel that gut punch. You got to do a little bit more. Work with legal services for the elderly. Don't just pass the buck. This has created the biggest cases I've ever worked on. Actually, the biggest case I ever worked on. Perpetrators hiding behind credible professions, titles, and images. We had a local pastor who was a wonderful man who would volunteer his services to local facilities, nursing facilities, to identify the most vulnerable and wealthiest people in the facilities. One of the cases is actually displayed here. I have 3 banker boxes of evidence. I put blood, sweat, tears into that case. And it happened just before COVID. And so the case was actually just brought this past year in a weird way. And all the charges, which were multiple felony charges, actually ended up being basically dismissed because of time, because my victim was passed away, because of a plethora of reasons that should have never been brought forward. I don't have a page in my state. And so I'm hoping that this case will help us be better together. I remember, I say, and I put this little note here, that don't let the lack of prosecution ever discourage you. because I was discouraged. This case was actually brought forth to a couple agencies that went 10-8 is like our code. 10-8 civil, no issue here. They need to go to legal services for the elderly, or they need to go to adult protective services. And I worked years on this case, and I went and visited the victim up at the main psych ward that day. I wanted her to have a voice because I was told that because she had some cognitive issues and suffered from a mental illness that she would never be a credible witness. And so I went up, and I was nervous because I've never been up there, and I didn't know what she was going to say to me, but I wanted her to have that voice. And even though my prosecution was not great, it was one of the best cases I ever worked, and I will carry this quote with me forever. I went up to the psych ward, and I got inside, and I sat down. I'm like, I don't know what's going to happen, if she's going to go crazy on me, because, you know, we all have those assumptions. And I looked at her, and she looked at me, and I said, this is who I am. Do you understand who I am, why I'm here? And she grabbed my hand, and she says to me, yes, ma'am. She says, I'm quoting this because I took it from my report. Yes, ma'am. She says, I have been bamboozled. And she squeezed my hand really hard, and she says, don't give up on people like me. I was like, that was like my, okay, I'm going to work. I only had one bigger box then. I developed two more because I'm like, this case is, we're going to do this, and we're going to protect these older people, but systems aren't in place yet, and it's unfortunate. But I turn it around and say, you know what, that was a success because I tried my best, and I can talk to you today about my failures so that hopefully we can turn those around and be better in these cases, because it's happening all the time. Our goal in law enforcement with the victimization of our older adults should not only be about prosecution, like I said, but securing victim safety, proving that we're taking these crimes seriously, and showing communities that we protect that we are there for them. Do good on time. So there was a case out of, I do have some pictures actually. I kind of discredited myself. Look, there's some more coming, right? So civil and criminal, like I told you, us in law enforcement, I was told we have two statute books. And when I was a young pup, a long time ago, they gave me the statute and said, we are responsible for everything in those two books. Those are our statutes, they're our Bibles. Those are the law enforcement Bibles, that's what we preach right there. And so I was like, okay, great. And like I told you, my first cases involved older population and collecting grandparents. And so I started looking for elder abuse. And there's no elder abuse crime. There's no statutes. There's nothing there. There's no teeth. And so I remember at night in my little moo-moo having tea, figuring out how am I going to apply our victims of elder abuse to these statutes. And Paige is going to talk more about that, but it's simple theft stuff. Just because there's no elder abuse crime, it doesn't mean elder abuse isn't happening in your states. It is happening, and it's happening a lot. And we got to be creative, and we need to take some time and really digest what our state has to offer for us. So even though there's civil aspects, there's probably some criminal aspects in these cases. And I challenge you to peel back those layers of those onions and give it a try, because you feel pretty good. Even if you don't get a great prosecution, you feel good knowing, you sleep good at night knowing that you tried the hardest that you could to protect our older population. This is a case out of Maine. I did not work this one, but it fascinates me, and we learn from it, and it gives you a little bit of inspiration. So this case came in as civil, but it was tried as criminal. Attorney Dawson acted as an agent for an 85 and a 97-year-old clients who resided in a nursing home. So he had them as clients. He was their attorney. He's entitled to reasonable compensation for his services, of course, but over the period of 4 years while Dawson managed these clients' properties, I have to read this down here, he billed and paid himself for unreasonable and possibly fictitious services at $250 an hour for driving to clients' homes, picking up mail, paying bills. So after all this happened, there was about $500,000 in question. The clients and their estates could have civilly sued Dawson for his actions, but those same actions also had criminal repercussions. Again, diving through your statute books, you can find this stuff, okay? He ended up pleading guilty to 2 counts of felony theft, 3 counts of failing to pay state income tax, sentenced to 5 years in prison with all but 2.5 suspended, and ordered to pay substantial restitution. The point of this case is that if somebody comes to you with a civil issue, investigate it as if it was criminal too, because you're going to miss so much. Don't be scared. Don't pucker and say, oh my God, it's civil. We can't do this. We're going to get sued. Talk to them, because there's way more. It's like that tip of the iceberg that we showed at the very beginning. And so those are the cases. I can tell you that over half of my cases come into me as some weird wonky thing that's not what I ended up investigating. It comes in as maybe a well-being check. It can come in as, well, let's take it back to the pastor case. He's the one that called in against my victim's guardian and conservator. He's the one that called it in against them because he's trying to one-up us, right? And it was him who was actually victimizing. You got to spend some time on these cases. We had a lady, this is a funny story I'll say real quick. Oh, I'm doing good. We got a well-being check on somebody in my prior agency every Saturday at 5 o'clock. I remember it was a joke. It was a crazy lady who calls in to ask about the pizza specials. Every Saturday at 5 o'clock. I didn't work Saturdays. I happened to pick up an overtime shift. And I'm the huggy-feely officer. The guys would always make fun of me. Oh, here's Candace, she'll go do it. She'll take care of them. Well, at 5 o'clock, she called and asked for the pizza specials. And, there was kind of an ongoing joke. And the guy's like, yeah, it's anchovies and onions, whatever they said. And they hang up the phone and like, oh, she's so nice. Has anybody gone to the house? Like, what's going on? This seems a little bit more than, the spidey senses, the gut punch. So I visited her. And every weekend around 5 o'clock, her son would come over. And he wasn't hurting her physically, but he was intimidating her enough to have her give him money every week. And we found out he had some substance use disorder issues. And this was kind of a cool case because I'm like big sister, and I ended up visiting the house frequently, and I think it made him really nervous. And so things started to get better, and he actually sought treatment, and he's like one of my success stories. So even though Paige never saw it, I'll never get a statistic to show. That's a pretty cool success that a law enforcement officer went in. It was a well-being check, and we stopped victimization of our older population. So we don't need to move big mountains. Like, I don't need to move a big mountain, but if we all take a little shovel and we start shoveling, we can make a dent in this. And it doesn't have to be a success in prosecution in the courts. I mean, it's great. Don't get me wrong. It's exciting, but I think we can all make a difference if we just step back and just do what we all signed up for, and that's to help people, right?
So I'm going to talk a little bit about elder financial exploitation from a prosecutor's perspective. And I thought I'd start with just going over some of the responses we hear when reports are made of these cases. And these responses come from 911 dispatchers, from patrol officers, from prosecutors, from detectives, from a lot of different people. And I think it's just important to think about what they are and think about how many of these cases die on the vine because somebody has shut it down out of usually just lack of training. Not lack of caring, but just lack of training. So one of the ones that I've heard many times, and I'm sure you all have too, is no victim, no case. If you don't have a victim, you can't bring a case like this. And we believe that if a victim suffers from dementia, that they're not available, they can't testify at trial. And we also often hear that if a victim can't testify at trial, the case can't be pursued. So again, these are really pretty common myths that predominate in prosecutors' offices and in law enforcement agencies. And what I would say about that is that there are many people with a dementia diagnosis, as Laura talked about earlier, who are plenty able to understand and to testify effectively, and maybe even more effectively than someone without dementia. I had an elderly man who was scammed by a Roma perpetrator who ended up testifying. And even though his memory was very, very poor, he had notes that he'd taken on like the day of the incident. And I was able to bring those notes into the trial and he could look at them and refresh his memory. And he testified beautifully at trial. And also what happens when you see someone with dementia testifying is their vulnerability is so obvious. And I think, again, the jury understood the victimization even better because of that. And the other thing I would just add again is what Laura had already talked about. She really stole my thunder today, that people with dementia often retain memory of emotional events much better than memory of non-emotional events. And this is actually based on a study that Laura conducted with her colleague. And so this is based on science. We know that this is true, and that's something you can get in your trials to the jury to help explain to them why it is, even if your victim, was confabulating about something, their testimony is reliable when it comes to what happened to them with regard to the crime that occurred. And we also, even if we don't have a victim, we often prove these cases. I think the majority of trials that I go to on financial cases, we don't have a victim anymore, but we're still able to prove the case, and usually successfully. And we do that through a bunch of different ways. Routinely, we get the victim's medical records because the doctor has seen them and may have also even seen the perpetrator or the caregiver. They may have taken statements from the victim that we can use at trial, and the victim may well have had significant cognitive impairment, which is always going to be very important at trial. But we also parse through all of the evidence we have, and we look for what statements of the victims are hearsay exceptions. And there are a few that are common across all states, and one of them is then existing state of mind. So a victim who says, I felt like they were taking my money. I felt like I didn't have any money, even though the victim has a lot of money. Any statements about how they were feeling at the time can be brought in at trial, even if the victim is not available anymore. And so we literally create a chart in every one of our financial cases of all the victim statements and of what hearsay statement may apply to try to get it into court without the victim. And it's been a very successful way for us to proceed in these cases. We also may have prior sworn testimony in a protection order hearing or from a civil proceeding or an APS hearing if you have APS hearings in your state. We also encourage our detectives to take a videotaped interview of the victim prior to the case going to trial, and usually as soon as possible after the crime has occurred. And they're not asking the victim what happened at the trial, because that would be hearsay, but they're asking the victim questions like, what did you do today? Tell us where you live. How many children do you have? And other questions that are designed to illustrate the victim's cognitive impairment. And if the victim has significant cognitive impairment and they can't remember where they live and they can't remember what they had for breakfast that day, we can get that videotape in at trial to show the victim's then existing state of mind, it's not hearsay, to show the jury just how vulnerable they were and how impaired they were. So when the defendant gets up and claims the victim consented to giving them their life savings, and we show a video like that, it's a pretty effective way to show that the victim's consent wasn't legitimate. Does that make sense to people? Okay, if you have questions as we go, I think we could probably handle them, so just let me know. The other thing we use is financial analysis of the victims and the suspect's records, the bank records. We are gifted in our office with a financial accountant, a forensic accountant who works for us full time. And I can't imagine bringing these cases without her, because she really helps us explain these cases and really understand what crimes occurred, what evidence we need, and then she testifies at trial to the jury about what happened to the victim's money and how the suspect spent her money. And it's just incredibly helpful. If you don't have that, which I know is a luxury, we've been able to get volunteer accountants from different forensic accounting groups, from sometimes retired accountants. There's usually a lot of accountants in the community who are very excited about working on cases like this. So those people are out there and they're very, very helpful to us. We often have abuse of power of attorney cases, so we're going to be bringing in that power of attorney document at trial. And then we may well have admissions the defendant made to other people that we can bring in at trial as well. So usually the absence of a victim at trial does not stop us from bringing a case. So there's that myth debunked, I hope. Another thing that we hear is, most of these financial exploitation cases are scams. And we know how devastating and awful scams are for older people. But we also know that the majority of elder financial exploitation cases are perpetrated by people close to the victim and people the victim trusts. And it's devastating enough when a stranger takes everything from you, but when it's your son or your daughter or someone you really thought your whole life that you trusted, it's even more devastating. And I think we see that damage when we work with these victims afterwards. Another response we hear to these crimes is that elder financial abuse is less serious than other forms of abuse. And that also is not borne out by data. One study done by Mark Lax and his colleagues out of Cornell Medical School was that any form of elder abuse increases the risk of premature deaths in the elderly by 300%. And we see that in our financial cases, how often these victims, once they realize what's happened to them, give up and they either become ill or they just lose interest in life, and they usually die quite quickly after the crime has occurred. It's a civil matter. Candace talked about this, and this is probably the most common refrain I think that victims are met with when their case is sort of banished, I guess, or extinguished too early. And I think this is a really confusing thing for law enforcement and for prosecutors. And the reason it's confusing is because these cases are civil. You can usually file a civil suit in response to financial exploitation or any form of elder abuse, but that doesn't mean they're not criminal. The question isn't, is this civil or is this criminal? The question is, do I have the evidence to prove each element of this crime beyond a reasonable doubt? I had a trial recently where I had a professor of elder law come and testify and explain to the jury what a power of attorney is and explain to the jury what it means when a case is civil versus criminal. And she said, murder cases are usually civil. That doesn't mean anything. What matters is, can we prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt? And it's a really important point. And that response that we often hear from people that this is civil is usually just based on the fact that they are not trained. They don't have any training or resources on how to investigate these cases. I think the most common form of financial exploitation that is mislabeled as civil are cases involving abuse of power of attorney and cases involving theft by deception or fraud. Those are the ones we often see not being investigated or prosecuted. So I just want to take a second to talk about abuse of power of attorney cases because they are truly the easiest form of elder financial exploitation that we can prosecute. We have a document, this power of attorney document, that specifically says what the perpetrator can and can't do with the victim's money. There is usually a gifting clause in that power of attorney that says, you as the attorney in fact can gift yourself $500 a year or $10,000 a year or whatever it says. And that is the law as far as what that perpetrator can do with the elder's assets. Beyond that, they must spend the elder's assets for the elder's benefit and not for themselves. And if they go ahead and steal everything the elder has and spend it on themselves, that's theft. And it's very easy for us to prove. And then theft by deception cases are other ones where I think there's just a lot of confusion. And this is where somebody, the perpetrator, lies to the victim and the victim gives them money based on those lies. That too is theft. And if we have those statements and we know that the victim actually believed those statements, we can prove those cases. So I thought I'd take you through a case that I handled a while ago. It's a great example of theft by deception. And I'll just take you through the investigation and first of all, the discovery of the case, then the investigation, and then the prosecution. So you can sort of see what happens with these cases over the course of the incident, from the incident through the investigation to the prosecution. Mariana Cooper was our victim. She was 86 years old at the time. And she also was pretty socially isolated. She had a couple of children, but she was estranged from them. And on top of that, her daughter, from whom she'd been estranged for so long, was dying of cancer. So Mariana was really having a difficult time. And when she was going through this, during that time, she met a woman named Janet Baumel, who was a personal organizer for her neighbor. And Janet became very interested in Mariana and pursued a friendship with her. She brought her cookies and she dropped over by her house frequently and just really cultivated this relationship with Mariana. And she called Mariana her mother. She said she was like a mother to her. And Mariana loved that because she finally wasn't feeling so alone in life, especially after this trauma of losing her daughter. And eventually she started talking to Mariana about her finances and started convincing her to let her assist her with her finances. And in fact, Mariana appointed Janet Baumel as her attorney in fact, or her power of attorney, in addition to the executor of her estate. So she really trusted her. And then after that came her request for money. And she had a lot of things she needed money for, according to her. And what she told Mariana was that she needed money to pay for her son's drug treatment. She talked about her own very abusive childhood, and she said she needed treatment for that still. She talked about the fact that she didn't have enough money to feed and clothe her children. So these were really pretty serious, desperate reasons that she gave Mariana for needing her money. And then she promised that this money that Mariana gave her would just be loans, that she'd be able to repay her through a job that she had, and also through an accident that she'd been in that was going to be giving her insurance proceeds. So as far as Mariana knew, this was a woman who needed her money desperately, and it was also a woman who was going to be able to repay her very soon. And over time, Janet Baumel became more and more brazen with her requests, asked for more and more money, and more emotional about it. And Mariana went along with it. And so with each request, she wrote Janet a check, and she wrote in the memo line what the reason for that check was: drug treatment, medical care, that kind of thing. And over the span of about 3 years, Mariana drained pretty much all of her accounts. And after her accounts were drained and her credit card equity was tapped, she started taking out loans on her credit cards. Janet then took her to an expert or a banker who did reverse mortgages, and had Mariana take out a reverse mortgage on her home that she owned, free and clear. And as she got dug in deeper and deeper into the situation, Mariana became increasingly afraid to confront Janet, because she was afraid that if she confronted her and got angry with her, that she would never be repaid. So it was just this, it became this cycle of borrowing on Janet's part that was impossible for Mariana to refuse. And then finally, Mariana needed a new roof on her house, and she had it done. And she was thinking in her mind, I can pay for this roof because Janet's going to repay me. So I'll have this money coming to me soon. So the roof is put on. She needs to pay the roofer. She tells Janet, you've got to repay me now. This is it. I'm at the end of my rope. And Janet disappears. So she's left owing this huge bill with literally no money left in her accounts or to her credit, in her credit accounts, I should say. So panicked, Mariana finally tells her granddaughter what's going on, and her granddaughter takes her to the bank, and they discover that over this 3-year period, Mariana had written 25 checks to Janet Baumel, amounting to over $217,000. Mariana agreed her granddaughter could call the police, which she did. Patrol came out, took a report, and then brought it back to the sergeant, who didn't assign a detective because he assumed this was civil and it wasn't going to go anywhere. And besides, Mariana was agreeing to give her the money. This was a gift, and there was nothing that the criminal justice system could do about it. But thankfully, Mariana's granddaughter was very aggressive and extremely angry, and so she started calling the police over and over and over again. And eventually, a detective was assigned, and the investigation began. And I think that was about a year after the discovery of the takings. And what the investigation revealed was that Janet Baumel did have a son who had gone through drug treatment, but the state had paid for his drug treatments. There was no need for Janet to pay for the drug treatment. We also got Janet Baumel's health records, her medical records, and her health insurance records. And of course, she had state paid health insurance, so there was no need for her to ask Mariana for money for that. And her medical care consisted of treatment for an underactive thyroid. So again, we were debunking these myths, these stories that she had told Mariana, which was crucial to our criminal case. She did go to a psychic, but that was something that we talked to Mariana about, and Mariana had never agreed to pay for a psychic for Janet. We also found out that Janet did have some income from a job at a cosmetics company, but there was no prospect of her getting much money from that job. We also found out that Janet had never been in an accident. So there was no insurance settlement that was going to be coming. So essentially, all of these stories that she had told Mariana, the detective was able to disprove and show were lies or deception. And then we also had we got Mariana's bank records and Janet's bank records, and found that all of Mariana's money went for purchases of clothing. She was a big fan of Coldwater Creek clothing. There were lots of purchases at Coldwater Creek clothing, lots of eating out at nice restaurants, trips across the country. So she really had just squandered the life savings of Mariana. So we also, as part of the investigation, asked the detective to have a capacity evaluation done of Mariana. And what I was worried about was that the jury was going to be kind of feeling like, well, you know, okay, so Janet was lying to her, but this is something she was still choosing to do. She never should have agreed to give her this money. She should have been more skeptical, to somehow blame Mariana for being so easily duped by Janet. And what we found from that capacity evaluation was that Mariana suffered from frontotemporal dementia. And Laura, I wonder if you could just step up for a minute and just explain briefly what that is. Do you mind using that?
So frontal temporal lobe dementia is a distinct type, just like Alzheimer's disease is. Sometimes people ask, well, what's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's? It's a little bit like asking what's the difference between a Volkswagen and a car, right? A car is this big category, a Volkswagen is a type. Dementia is a big category. Alzheimer's is a type. frontal temporal lobe dementia is a type as well. And what you have with frontal temporal lobe dementia are prominent changes in personality, judgment, kinds of things that happen very early, which are much more obvious than memory trouble. So people may start acting in weird ways that are really very uncharacteristic for them.
And Laura, when I talked to Mariana, she was very smooth. I mean, she was very articulate. I would never have noticed anything as far as any cognitive impairment. Is that unusual for someone with frontotemporal dementia?
No, that's a very common kind of thing, is that unless you really do specific testing to try to figure it out, you may not notice it in a normal conversation, but you see somebody who's going out of their usual pattern of behavior, that something unusual is going on. And oftentimes the perpetrators who are trying to take advantage of them really have radar for people like that, because it's not super obvious to those around them, and are really take advantage and are able to manipulate them quite easily.
Thank you. Any questions about this? Yeah. So the question was, can we do anything after they're deceased, or can we only bring this if the victim is still alive? So I talked about this no victim, no case being a bit of a myth. So in many cases, we can still proceed even if the victim is deceased. In a case like this, we had a couple things going for us. We had the fact that on every check, Mariana wrote the reason for the check. So our financial analyst was able to look at all of those checks and say, actually, this money was not spent on drug treatment for Mariana or for Janet's son, like the check says it was for. So what it actually was spent for were trips to Coldwater Creek and to the East Coast for a vacation. So that was enough to get us to deception there. So I think we would have had a pretty good chance of succeeding on that case, even without Mariana's testimony. But even though Mariana had dementia, she was able to testify. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. But usually between the financial analysis and the sort of surrounding circumstances and the corroborating evidence, we are able to still proceed on those cases. Not always, but usually. So what we ended up doing was filing charges. I was very worried about proving this case because I was just worried that it was going to be that a jury might not believe Mariana or might not be very sympathetic to her because she was very angry, and legitimately so. It took probably 3 years for the case to go to trial. So it was a long time of the investigation didn't start for a year. And then after it started, it took another year. And then it took a long time for the case to actually go to trial. So there was a lot of upset on Mariana's part and her granddaughter. They were very angry. They were not happy people, and they were not happy about our prosecution of the case. I mean, they were glad we prosecuted it, but they were really not happy with how long it had taken. And so I was worried that all of that might make it a kind of unappealing case for the jury. So for that reason, I really thought it was important to bring in the evaluator of Mariana's capacity also to explain how her dementia was impacting her decision-making and made her more likely to believe the lies Janet told her, and just in general to make her more sympathetic. So we ended up filing multiple charges of theft by deception or theft by fraud. There are other charging theories we could have used here. We could have used the fact that Janet was Mariana's power of attorney and charged it as theft by embezzlement or theft by a fiduciary. But because Janet didn't actually write the checks herself, we couldn't really proceed on that theory. Had Janet been writing the checks to herself as power of attorney and signing them as Mariana's power of attorney, we absolutely could have proceeded that way. But instead, we had Mariana writing all of the checks herself and giving them to Janet. So it made that theory pretty difficult. We also could have potentially proceeded on a theory of lack of capacity because Mariana clearly had significant cognitive impairment and lacked financial capacity, even though she was able to carry on a conversation. But because that cognitive capacity was so hidden and so not obvious, we would have had to show that Janet knew that Mariana lacked capacity, and we couldn't show that. So it was too subtle for us to proceed on a theory of incapacity. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So really our only theory that we could go forward on was theft by deception. And so that theory was that Janet lied to Mariana and Mariana gave her money based on those lies. And that was how we ended up charging the case. We charged, I think, 10 or 11 counts of theft by deception. We couldn't charge for all of the 25 checks because they were outside the statute of limitations by the time the case came to trial, or the case was filed, actually. So our witnesses were law enforcement. Mariana herself testified, and she didn't remember a lot of the details of each of the checks, but she was able to look at the check and say, yeah, that's my handwriting. Yeah, that's my handwriting on the memo line that said that this check was intended for medical treatment or for drug treatment. And just to talk about the impact that the takings had had on her. So I think she ended up being a very compelling witness and a very effective witness. We had the capacity evaluator, as I mentioned, and then we ended the trial, as we do really in all of our cases, with the testimony of our financial analyst, who went through all of Mariana's finances and explained how she'd been literally ravaged by Janet Baumel financially, and then exactly how Janet spent the money, showing that all the stories that Janet was telling Mariana were definitely lies and were not true. And that's how we proved our case. Janet Baumel did not testify, but she put on her children, I think more to try to get the jury to feel sympathetic to her. And she also put on Mariana's doctor, because Mariana's primary care provider didn't notice any dementia and thought Mariana was completely fine. And I wonder, Laura, if you might be willing to defend your profession here and talk about that.
So overall, unfortunately, we do a really bad job of this. We physicians just don't do a good enough job of cognitive testing and documentation when there's a problem. You know, we get fooled too, just like everybody else does, especially when it's somebody who maybe we've known for a long time and we're familiar with them. We just don't necessarily think to ask the questions, to dig a little deeper and do a cognitive exam. We are pushing very hard nationally for really simple screening tools for every primary care physician to use on any older adult to look for maybe there's a problem, which would then lead to a larger screening exam. But I will say so far, the uptake is not anywhere close to where we would like for it to be. And it creates a problem. It really creates a problem in when you have these sorts of documents saying that everything is just fine. So I cannot defend our profession on this, but I can say that we're working hard to make it better so that physicians are more attuned to screening for a cognitive impairment and then going further if the screening shows that there might be a problem.
And Laura, it seems to me that compounding that is the fact that many people with early dementia don't recognize it. So their patients coming in saying, I'm absolutely fine. And so it's a difficult situation for a primary care provider, right?
It is a difficult situation, but it's why we have to screen. And there are really simple tools that we can use to just say everything is good, or gee, we need to look further. So yes, we can get fooled, but it's not a good enough reason to miss it. We really have to be vigilant and look more deeply than we currently are.
And I will say I've had, I think, 3 trials now where the defense has put on the primary care provider to say the victim had no impairment. So it's really awkward for them, and it's just a bummer. Thank you. So the trial lasted about 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, and then the jury was out for about a day or a day and a half. And they came back and they convicted Janet of 10 counts of theft in the first and second degrees. They also found an aggravator of major economic offense because she had taken so much money from Mariana. And she was sentenced to 43 months in prison, which for us is a very, very long time on a financial case. At the time of her sentencing, she had found employment on a marijuana grow operation. So unfortunately, she had to leave that employment and go to prison. And I'm sure she's been out now for a while. But another wonderful thing that ended up coming out of this was that Mariana and her granddaughter lobbied for a new crime of theft from a vulnerable adult in Washington, and we got that bill passed. And I think they felt like something really good had come out of this case, which was really wonderful. And they also had a story on them done in the New York Times. So I think that left Mariana feeling like she had really gotten some justice, even though she probably will never get her money back. Yes, Laura.
And does this sort of conviction prevent her from being able to become a conservator or a power of attorney for anybody else in the future?
I think it's state by state. In our state, APS has a registry, and so they will put you on a registry if there's a finding made against you of abuse or neglect or financial exploitation. That would prevent you from working in a long-term care facility. I don't think it would prevent you from serving as a power of attorney or a guardian. So it's of limited value, but of some value. But you know, we also asked the court to order, and the court did order that Janet never serve in any kind of fiduciary relationship for the next 10 years. That also will hopefully help with that. Okay, so I just want to, and then restitution is another thing I just wanted to briefly mention. We, of course, had the court order restitution, which was great. But we also, in some of our cases, we end up negotiating restitution. So we will often do where there's money left, where the victim has given the perpetrator money or had money stolen by the perpetrator, and that money is somehow available to the perpetrator still. We will create kind of a tiered recommendation where we incentivize to the perpetrator to repay the victim in return for getting a lower sentence. And it's not a great thing. I wish we could just lock these people up for a long time in response to these crimes. But for most of these victims, getting their money back is the most important thing we can do for them. And once in a while, we're able to do that. In this case, we weren't able to do that because Janet had spent all the money. But sometimes the money's still there, or the perpetrator has land they can sell or something else they can sell. And then we will do everything in our power to create an incentive for them to repay the victim when that's what the victim asked for. Okay, I'm just going to end now just briefly with just talking about what I think we need to properly respond to these cases, and then Candace will come back and talk about that from her perspective. There are just so many places, as I've said, where these cases end up being extinguished, and I think we've got to be training all the different people who might come into contact with a case like this so that they aren't. And that means 911 dispatchers, it means patrol officers, it means detectives, and it means prosecutors. And I think just training detectives and just training prosecutors isn't enough because these cases are so hard. And, you know, they usually require months of investigations and financial analysis and a lot of different specific knowledge about a lot of different things and a lot of work. And so if I am bringing DV cases and sex cases and elder abuse cases, inevitably the most difficult cases are going to be pushed to the back burner. And that's what I think happens when you have detectives and prosecutors who have a wide range of cases. They also don't have the relationships that they need to make these cases successful. Because all I do is elder abuse, I work with the detectives in our community, even though we have 39 agencies we work with, 39 police agencies. I work with those detectives who are also specialized. Derek Sandbeck is here from SBD, and he and I work together all the time. And so we have this amazing relationship, which really goes a long way in helping us respond to these cases properly. And those relationships are crucial, and that's why it's just so important to have dedicated detectives and prosecutors. Again, collaboration and coordination with other key disciplines, having Laura Mosqueda to call, a doctor in your community to call and say, what do you think about this? What do you think about these injuries? Or what do you think about this capacity issue? And help me make the right decision here. And getting that input is just absolutely crucial to our cases. Having a financial analyst, again, we also need. I am not a numbers person. I could never do these cases by myself. But because I have someone who is, I'm able to bring these cases. And then cognitive capacity experts are also crucial. I also just want to briefly mention the Office on Violence Against Women's Abuse in Later Life grant. Janice Green is here from OVW. She has a table in the back. And if anyone is interested in potentially getting grant funding to train their system, you should talk to her. They have an RFP coming out shortly. And what they do is fund a community basically to train their prosecutors, their detectives, their patrol officers, their APS investigators, and also to create a coordinated community response to respond to these cases effectively in the community. And I've seen it transform community after community in this country, and it's just the most amazing thing. So if you're interested, talk to Janice about that. And now Candace is going to talk to you about her perspective on what we need.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, all right. So our jobs as law enforcement officers, it's not what you see on the TV. We don't get these, this fancy equipment, and we know exactly what we're doing, and we know exactly who we're supposed to call, and all of our cases go to court, and it's like this great theme music in the background, and then the bad guy loses and the good guy wins. Like, that's just not how it is. And so I think the reality when it comes to investigating or even caring about our older population who are victims of crime is to be there for them and to be proactive, be more proactive in our communities so that they can feel comfortable telling you about the most intimate stuff in their life. Like I said, 90% of all our suspects are somebody they love and trust. They don't know me from a hole in the wall. I got to put a little more effort into my community so that they know that I care about them. You know, anybody can talk the talk, but you got to walk the walk. And so I think seeing you as law enforcement officers or supervisors of our officers, get them in there, out in the community. You know, and I always say it to the cadets, I said it earlier, you know, we signed up for this job to help people. It's not really about driving the cool cars and stopping them and whatever. It's to help people. And I just happen to have a huge passion for this niche of crime. I have for a while. I've held their hands. I've wiped their tears. And I do not ever promise them that they are going to go to court. And quite frankly, 9 times out of 10, they don't want to see their son in jail. Right? So you got to work with them and form relationships with other people, other teams. You know, law enforcement, great, but you should have legal services for the elderly on your speed dial. You should have a page on your speed dial just to see. You should have local doctors who understand this way more than we do, so that we can work together to make sure the victim is safe, and then peel back that onion and develop a case. We should not jump into cases and say, okay, this is a civil issue, we can't investigate it. No, this is a community issue and I'm going to investigate it. And if we come up with nothing, it's okay. But we're going to ask the appropriate people. We're not going to be too strong and too bullheaded to not call Paige or call legal services for the elderly, okay? So don't measure your success by prosecution. Measure your success by doing the right thing. And the right thing may be just connecting them with services, with the son, with substance use treatment disorder resources. Just do something. It's kind of the oxymoron statement that I heard, and it just kind of sticks with me. Don't do nothing, right? The gut punch happens, do something. Whether it's a follow-up, going to their house again and seeing if there's a little bit more, if there's another layer that we're missing. But the whole goal, and like we talked about before, restitution, it's hard to get money back. We'll never get their independence and dignity and respect and trust back. It's just not possible. So the goal would be to stop it before it starts, to plant those seeds so that it doesn't grow into an issue where we have to kind of throw it at the wall and see if it sticks. You know, it's difficult. It's difficult. Stay educated and aware of statutes. My books are different than her books. Your books, they're all different. We're all different states, right? But we got to do something about it. We got to understand what we're up against so that we can help our older population just a little bit better. I still can't see that. I'm going to try this now here. And like I said, get connected to other professions as soon as possible and don't pass the buck. I know early on, I would say, okay, this is like an elder abuse case. This is going to be APS. All right, it's going to be them, case closed. No, work together. So it's your case together. You learn such cool things and you hear the greatest stories from our older population. They're just amazing. Give them a chance to talk. I already talked about, I'm beating that to death about the prosecution thing. I'd love every case to be prosecuted, but sometimes it's not possible. And that's not even appropriate because maybe that's the last person left in their life because it's the son. You got to work together, all together, to find out what the best result would be for that victim, not for me. I don't work my cases for me. I work my cases for my victims. And sometimes I want to charge and I want to go all crazy like the movies, but it's what's important to the victim. It should be important to us. And just know we can't do this alone. We really can't. We just got to swallow our pride, reach out, and make sure that we do the best we can for our victims. And the last thing, I can't say this enough, I was lucky enough to testify in front of Congress back in 2019, and I made the recommendation then I'll make it now. We need to have more dedicated, trained elder abuse detectives in every state in the United States, because we are tasked, especially with municipal officers, to know a lot, to know maybe a little bit about a lot, but we don't have specialized units of crime for elder abuse and drug crime and who knows. We need that, especially Maine's oldest state in the nation, and we're falling vastly behind, and it's frustrating. Sometimes I'm running so fast, I think, but I'm running in place. So it's so important to have to convene like this and to have people on our side to understand and recognize how important this is. And so I don't have to go to the psych ward again, hold hands and have someone say, don't give up on me, right? So I have so much inspiration being here, knowing that we have the Andys and the Shelleys who are convening us, knowing that we have pages, I need her in like every state, to empower us as officers that it's okay to do the huggy, feely, lovey, whatever they call me, cases, because to me, I'll take this stuff to the grave, and I have the opportunity to hopefully inspire other people to take care of those who once took care of us. So that's my whole gist for today. I could go on for probably 2 days. Most of you guys know that about my cases and my desire for this niche, but reach out to us because we're willing to make some changes.
We have our addresses here, so please feel free to take advantage of those and call us or email us. But we have a little time left, even though lunch is on the horizon. Does anyone have any questions for us or comments? Yes.
Oh, sorry. I had a question about the trial that you discussed.
Yeah.
Did you have any evidence other than from the victim that the defendant was saying, yeah, I'll be paying you this money back?
No. Like most of these cases, the conversations were private, so no one else was hearing what Janet Baumel was telling Mariana during the course of the taking. So it was really all based on Mariana's word. I mean, the only thing we had that was corroboration was the memo line on her checks.
And I guess my next question is, did that make any difference in terms of if she said, I'm asking for this money for my kid to get drug treatment, and she was actually using it to go buy clothes, is that enough for you? I mean, and for theft by deception, even if she isn't agreeing to pay it back?
Even if she isn't going to give it back?
Right, even if it's not a loan, for example, if she's just taking the money.
If she said, I want you to gift me this money because my son needs drug treatment.
Right.
And we can show the son did not need drug treatment. He'd already had drug treatment. It was paid for by the state. Absolutely, that would be fine.
Okay.
Yeah, because her gift, I mean, assuming Mariana would have said, yes, I gave her that money because her son needed drug treatment. I relied on those statements. And as long as she says that, then the loan versus the gift doesn't really matter.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
He's from Maine.
But it is true that it's definitely harder to bring these theft by deception cases without the victim. I think they're the hardest form of financial exploitation to bring if you don't have a victim who can testify. Yeah, any other questions?
This one's for Laura. In regards to doctors not looking, is there an online forum or a site that we can, I'm right here, a site that we can go to find the doctors that would have the knowledge for this? Or is there a specific type of doctor that we need to contact? Because MD is a lot of different things.
Yeah, you're exactly right that the initials after our name do not mean that we know how to assess somebody's cognition or capacity, which are actually two different things. Assessing cognition will be just physician dependent. Certainly geriatricians, neurologists who work in this field, psychiatrists who work in this field, geropsychologists who do neuropsych testing. So again, even if you're a geriatrician, do you know how to assess capacity? Most of us do, but you'd really want to know that this person has expertise in that. That's number one. Number two, assessing for cognition is not the same as assessing for capacity. So somebody can have a dementia like Alzheimer's disease, and they may have capacity for some things and not for others. So saying that somebody is diagnosed with dementia does not now mean that they lack capacity to make any sorts of decisions. I'm often asked to help figure out capacity in certain situations. So it's really different, right? There's different standards for capacity for marriage, for financial transactions. In those cases, you might want somebody who is more familiar with the legal system. I'm oftentimes asked to figure out, does somebody have the capacity to provide consent for a surgical procedure? And it depends on how complicated it is and what the risks are as well. So I don't know if I answered your question well enough, but I think you're bringing up an important point, which is it's not just about the initials after your name, asking a few more questions in order to find out, is this something you're familiar doing. And then I would say also going to academic institutions where there may be a greater likelihood of specialized training in this area can be good. And the last thing I'll mention is we do a lot of reach out. So for example, recently we had a case come through our forensic center, and there was a primary care physician who seemed very good, but didn't know how to do capacity declaration. We walked him through that. We helped him, we taught him how to fish basically instead of doing it for him. So, so those are the sorts of things that I would encourage you to think about. And then I've given you my email address. It's firstname.lastname@med.usc.edu. I will always try to help you find somebody closer to home or to offer my services when I'm available to.
Or one other place that we end up finding capacity evaluators is I've called elder law attorneys. So attorneys in your community who are doing guardianships and conservatorships, they almost always need to have a capacity evaluation done of the victim. So whoever they're using is probably someone who might be helpful.
Right. They don't do the capacity
No.
assessments, right? But they might know people
Yes.
who are good at doing that.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Oh, sorry, I have one right here. So this one's for Laura as well. Sorry.
Stealing my
Don't
thunder.
run away. The frontotemporal dementia. So again, not easy to recognize by lay people. As law enforcement, we might not recognize it. And they might go in, see their primary care, do like a mini mental or a slums. It might not indicate to them that there is any sort of dementia. Like they could still pass it. We wouldn't know. So what specific testing would need to be done and by what kind of physician? And then my second part of my question is this then indicative of persons who are more susceptible to scams, fraud? Is this possibly the affliction that they might have to make them more vulnerable towards those types of crimes?
I'll answer the second question first, which is anybody who has a cognitive impairment is generally more susceptible to scams and frauds and more easily manipulatable, whatever the right word is there, easier to manipulate for sure. Bad guys seem to have radar for finding people with early cognitive impairments. There are also studies done, and we're doing now neuroimaging where we're actually looking. You've probably heard of CT scans and MRIs, but there are scans now called functional MRIs where you can actually look at the metabolism, like what's going on in the brain. And we're actually now finding age-related changes in the brain that are linked to greater susceptibility to scams or frauds. My colleague Duke Han is a real leader in this area. So we're actually have a study where you can do a written test and figure out who is more susceptible to being scammed or defrauded. And then we're putting them in a functional MRI scanner, a very high quality one we have at USC, in finding differences. This is all preliminary, but it's pretty interesting to figure this out. And it turns out that some people have no cognitive impairment, but do have impaired on testing, on detailed testing, that actually have impairment with their decision-making capacity. So we're trying to unwind that a little bit. So sorry, I got into the weeds a little bit. Let me then back up and mention that you should be able to pick up frontal temporal lobe dementia with something like a SLUMS, which is St. Louis something mental status. It was St. Louis University because they developed it there. Some people are familiar with something, and I'll finish in just a second, Andy, what's called the full steam mini mental state exam, or the MMSE. That is an exam I don't like. It's a very left brain test. It doesn't pick up the executive function kinds of stuff. We're much more likely now to either use a SLUMS or something called a MOCA, or Montreal Cognitive Assessment. Even a brief cognitive screen, something called the mini-cog, will pick up frontal temporal lobe dementia. So it really shouldn't be missed.
Just keep in mind that as investigators, And prosecutors, what we have to prove is that the suspect or the perpetrator knew the victim had dementia or lacked capacity, if that's going to be our theory. So if it's a super subtle form of dementia like Mariana's was, we can't proceed on a theory that they lacked capacity. We still want to know about their capacity because it affects what kind of treatment they get and it affects potentially how vulnerable they were, but it may not be able to be the main theory of our case because it's so subtle. Okay, I think we have to stop now. Thank you all very much.